I guess we're getting started. I guess this is everybody today until Eli walks in late. This is week 2 of 2, talking about genetics and science versus evolution this quarter. Last week, for those of you who weren't here, we were zooming in one more time. So we started last week by looking at the fact that we've been kind of zooming in all quarter. We started with looking at the universe as a whole, where it came from. We then looked at a subpart of the universe, which is matter. Where did matter come from? We looked at a subpart of matter, which is life. Where did life come from? Now we're looking at a part of life, which is genetics. And we're going through this assuming that they can figure out an explanation for where the universe came from, and figure out an explanation for where matter came from, and figure out an explanation for where life came from, and even figure out an explanation for where the original genetic information came from, which information in and of itself can't come from random sources, as we looked at in week 2. We're giving them all of that. Once they have simple DNA, simple genetic information, can they get from there to more complex information? And that's where we're tackling this, is if we give them all of that, can natural processes add genetic information to what's already existing? And we looked at a couple of different methods that they try to use to do that. And we looked at natural selection, we looked at genetic mutation, we looked at microevolution. And what we found with all of those things is that none of those methods add information. They just use the existing information. The existing information determines the survival of the fittest, but the survival of the fittest can't add additional information back into the genome. So the problem of them trying to need to take simple information and make it more complex, or take a little bit of genetic information and add more, is not solved by any of those things. And so we left off with this, we left off part of it with this screen, and we said that if natural selection and genetic mutations are insufficient to explain the addition of new genetic information, then they have to try and figure out accounting for the additional genetic information that we have somehow. Okay? And beyond that, not just additional genetic information, they have to account for how genetic information is existing is getting more and more complex as we add genetic information on it. So not only is there more genetic information, but what there is getting cooler in and of itself. How do they account for that complexity? They have to find other ways of adding genetic material to what already exists. And we looked at several different theories that they've used for how to add that genetic material. We looked at duplications, where in the copying process, genetic information is copied more than once. We look at the fun word polyploidization, which, if you don't know what that is, go back and watch last week's recording, because that's a whole different explanation. And we left off last week starting to talk about epigenetics. For those of you that were here last week, what is epigenetics? What does the prefix epi mean?
It's been a week.
It's been a week. That's fair. I don't remember what I did yesterday, so you're fine. The prefix epi is a Greek prefix, and it means on or over. So the word epistala, which we get our word epistle, is on paper. So epi being on or over. So epigenetic change is change that happens on or over the actual genetics of a creature. So this is more behavioral. This is more trained and how different behaviors exhibit themselves in the life of the creature versus the actual genetic makeup of the creature. Okay? It's changes that happen from one generation to the next that occur above or outside of the actual genetics of the creature. Do we think that this kind of change is going to provide them the answer that they seek in the origin of genetic information? I don't think so, but we'll see why it really doesn't here in a second. In 2013, a study was conducted on mice. A cherry blossom smell was introduced to these mice, and with that smell, they had their feet shocked repeatedly, and this sort of trained them to be fearful of the cherry blossom smell. Because after time, the behaviors developed, and so that whenever the cherry blossom smell was presented to these mice, they would automatically become fearful of whatever shock was coming, whether or not the shock actually came. Okay? The mice's offspring were then studied, and they were found to also be fearful of the cherry blossom smell, even without any shock treatment. So this changed behavior from the parent mice to the offspring mice seems to be passed on from that generational gap, even though there was no genetic change in the offspring mice. The same genetics were there. There was no necessary mutation or anything that happened to result in this kind of behavioral change. It's just a difference in behavior outside of genetics. Okay? And in fact, in the children mice, the reaction actually occurred at much smaller amounts of the cherry blossom smell and induced a much stronger reaction than it had in the parent mice, indicating that what change was passed on was actually far stronger than it was with the original conditioning. There's a few problems with this. Okay? The first of these problems being that the changes presented in the mice were not substantial enough to allow for evolution. Okay, just because the mice developed a fear of a particular smell doesn't make them any less mice. This kind of behavioral change doesn't get them any closer to being a bird, or a dog, or a horse, or a human. They're still very much so mice. So to conclude from this study that, therefore, humans are clearly able to evolve from single-celled organisms into what they are today is a blind leap of faith far beyond what the evidence actually indicates. And again, as we've said several times, if your whole worldview is based on only believing in and only putting stock in what you can verify scientifically, why would you make that kind of leap of faith? That doesn't make sense.
So that wouldn't even be microevolution because nothing in the genetic code actually changed.
Right.
Their skin color didn't change. They didn't change like the tails. Like it was literally just a learned behavior traits. Mm-hmm. But how is that passed down?
And that's the study of epigenetics, is the idea that non-genetic changes can happen from generation to generation, and it can happen outside of the actual genetic code. You're onto something, though, where a good question is presented. What evidence does this give us? I'm sure we'll get to it in a second, but what evidence does this give us of actual additional genetic information? If it's not genetics and if it's just behavioral, how does behavioral change from one generation to another feed back into the genetic code of the creature? There's no process to do that. So, in the end, this whole epigenetic study does nothing to actually solve their genetic problems and how to add genetic information from one generation to another. But there are more problems. The changes presented in the mice didn't actually last long enough for them to cumulatively change them into a different creature. They were temporary. The children mice showed a reaction to the cherry blossom smell, but the grand mice, so the second generation, showed significantly less reaction to the cherry blossom smell than the children. And the reaction was fully gone after that second generation, which indicates that the change was temporary. Okay, even if it did last in some small way across multiple generations, the change presented in those mice was temporary. So if they're going to claim that epigenetic change is somehow a source for genetic evolution, which they can't define how, but somehow it's a source for genetic evolution, and genetic evolution is the result of minor changes stacking up over time until you eventually get to a different creature, then you would have to have epigenetic changes that last long enough in order to stack up over time. Epigenetic changes don't do that. They simply don't last long enough to stack up over time. Because they're so temporary, they cannot be a source of evolution. So while epigenetics is a fascinating study, it is not sufficient to explain the additional genetic information that we need. But who would have thought? There are more problems. Even if it was sufficient to explain genetic evolution, it's hard to argue that epigenetic changes would have actually happened under the evolutionary model. It literally would never have happened under the evolutionary model. Evolution, by its definition and nature, at its very core, what it is random. Random inputs using random processes that randomly stack up and put random creatures in random environments, and then the genetics thereof help determine the survival of the fittest to pass on the better genetics. It's all random. But epigenetic change is, by definition and nature, intentional. Anybody ever trained a dog? The behavioral change that you need to induce in that dog when you train it, does that ever happen by accident? The mice in this study...
It can happen involuntarily.
It can happen involuntarily? Explain that.
Okay, so like, I can put my shoes on, and they be my indoor shoes, and I can have outdoor shoes. And The dog can know that whenever I put on outdoor shoes, that it's time for a walk. Right? And it
Okay.
can know based off of consistent circumstances in its environment that X input equals Y output.
Okay.
Right?
But
So that comes from consistency, though. Nature tends to not be consistent.
well, and beyond consistency, it's impact from something outside of it that's repeated, and the dog learned what it means. And maybe that's literally what you were talking about.
It's the consistency, yeah. And while there are some things that can be consistent, so like you might have a sunrise and a sunset, you might have different weather cycles, and so if the dog sees clouds, the dog might in its brain say, "Oh, there's rain coming." Maybe there's rain coming, maybe there's not. But maybe that is some small behavioral expression of some sort of learned behavior that could happen by accident, but not to the degree that we're talking, and not to the degree that they would need in order to explain evolution.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Dogs don't get trained by accident.
No.
These mice in the study didn't develop a fear of cherry blossom randomly. They only developed that fear because it was intentionally introduced and the shock was intentionally consistently applied to their feet. All of these changes in behavior are brought about by an intentional effort on the part of some outside entity training a new behavior into a creature. Epigenetics involve directed change, not random, but such intentionality and direction are fundamentally opposite to evolution at its core. The last problem that we'll look at with epigenetics is that epigenetics provide no explanation for new or additional genetic information, kind of like what we were talking about earlier. Is there any new or genetic information new genetic information produced by epigenetics? No new genetic information came about in the mice as a result of their conditioning. Rather, existing genetic information was conditioned to express itself differently. The same smell was processed in a similar way. The same fight or flight instinct within the mice was present in the mice and had that result of the being afraid of the shock, whether or not the shock was present. No new genetic information was added or taken away in this process. The existing information was trained to be expressed in a way that made the mice fearful of cherry blossom smells. So unfortunately for atheists, epigenetics provides no new explanation for adding additional genetic information to the genome. But again, that's what's required. In order to go from a simple single-celled organism with basic information to where we're at today with humans, you have to have some fundamental, completely natural process for adding genetic information. And they simply don't have that. Now we move on to antibiotic resistance. This one's fun. Antibiotic resistance is a change in a bacterium that makes it immune, or at least very resistant to an antibiotic. And there are several ways in which antibiotic resistance can develop in a bacterium. It can occur in a variety of ways. It can happen naturally, where the bacterium is born, for lack of a better word for that, with such a resistance. It can happen just naturally in its genetic code. They can acquire it from genetic mutations. So in the splitting of the bacterium into two from the one, there can be a genetic mutation where it acquires antibiotic resistance. It can happen from conjugation, which is a fascinating process that we're not even going to touch. It's where two or more bacteria merge into one and pool existing information. That is where we're leaving. That is not simple. They can also acquire it through DNA transposition, where there's some outside source of genetic information, such as another bacterium that doesn't merge, or a virus or something, and through other complicated processes, the DNA from that outside source gets added into the bacteria. Okay? A variety of ways, and it's a perfectly legitimate scientific topic. Bacteria evolving to gain resistance is okay, and it's acceptable under the Christian worldview. It's a very well-established scientific process. Our question, though, is whether or not this scientific process of developing antibiotic resistance, does that explain, let alone prove, how genetic information can be added to the genome as is required by evolution? Okay? Hopefully this is not a spoiler alert, but there are several issues with this. The first is asking a question, what are we actually observing? The bacteria are still bacteria. They may change slightly. They may have a different trait that they didn't before, but they're still fundamentally bacteria. In no way does the reality of antibiotic resistance, or even the ability for bacteria to develop such a resistance when they didn't have it before, in no way does that imply that bacteria could turn into a flamingo, if only given enough time. Not once has such a macroevolution event ever been observed. It's only been hypothesized as potentially possible. There's no evidence to indicate that a jump from one species to another is actually tangibly possible. And so, again, any conclusion based on anything that we observe in the direct evidence is inevitably a massive leap of faith. Far larger than any belief in God, at least by my estimation. Okay? The second issue here, is there any new genetic information when a bacteria develops antibiotic resistance? There's not. All of the methods that we looked at for a bacterium developing antibiotic resistance fall into one of three categories. Number one, it could be that the genetic information was already inside the bacterium. It was just born with it naturally. Second one could be that it's a pooling of existing genetic information between two or more bacterium, whether it's conjugation or some sort of DNA transposition from an outside source. The information already exists, and it's just being pooled together inside the bacterium. Or it's a genetic mutation. Every method that we looked at falls into one of these three categories. But if the information already is inside the bacterium to make it resistant to antibiotics, okay, that doesn't tell us anything about where genetic information comes from. If there's a pooling of genetic information between two or more bacterium, okay, the information already exists. It might be additional genetic information for the single bacterium. I'm going to mix up my plurals all day, FYI. It might be an additional bit of information for the single bacterium, but that information already exists. It's just not necessarily in that bacterium. No new information is being generated. And we've already looked at genetic mutations. Genetic mutations are bad on the whole. Most mutations produce adverse effects. So on the whole, mutations produce a decline in whatever population they present themselves. None of these methods actually add any new information. And so if there's no tangible process by which to add genetic information to the genome, antibiotic resistance is no more than an interesting thought exercise. Evolutionists will attempt to say that it explains new information in bacteria, but that's simply not the case. Another issue with this is, I think, a bit of discussion is warranted on whether or not the bacteria are actually better off. Okay? Again, the basic premise of evolution is that originally there were simple single-celled organisms with very basic genetic information, and over time that information got more and more complex until today we get to humans. And with each step along the evolutionary chain, we would expect the resulting next generation to be better off, on average. Of course, there's going to be some variability, but if you're going to get from simple single-celled organisms to the peak of genetic evolution as we have today, on average, you would have to get better and better and better genetics. Okay? That's the only way that they could have enough of an upward trend of genetics to pull off macroevolution. But what's actually happening when a bacterium develops antibiotic resistance? Well, let's think about it. Bacteria are microorganisms that are generally harmful to especially us humans, and antibiotics attack various aspects of the bacterium depending on the particular bacterium and the particular antibiotic. Okay? To develop resistance to an antibiotic, something about the bacterium will have to change. It is already fully formed and functionally complete because it exists. But something about it will have to change. When you take something that's fully formed and functional like that and you modify it in any meaningful way, odds are it's not going to be better off. For example, let's say that one such evolution in a bacterium is to enlarge an export pump. Okay? The export pump in the bacteria allows it to dispel with whatever waste might be in there. And so if the bacteria or the antibiotic attacks the bacteria will be able to take the antibiotic, and if it has an enlarged export pump, dispel with it more easily, making it more resistant to the antibiotic. Okay? That would make it resistant to the antibiotic, and that's exactly the kind of evolutionary change that they're claiming supports macroevolution. But my question is whether or not having that enlarged export pump is actually better off for the bacterium overall. And according to a 2016 study, even in the relatively rare instance where a mutation led to a positive outcome of antibiotic resistance, the bacteria that were studied were shown to actually be worse off overall. They were definitely better off when it came to be in the presence of antibiotics. They were able to deal with antibiotics more effectively. But the adverse effects were seen in other areas of existence compared to bacteria without antibiotic resistance. And that made them actually worse off overall. And this should make sense to us in general. This is actually what we would expect. Let's apply this line of thinking to humans, just to make it easier for us to understand. If a human were to have eyes that are microevolutionary changed, to take in significantly less light, that in theory would allow the human to stare directly at the sun without adverse consequences. What you got?
Those adverse effects, would you happen to have any examples of those adverse effects?
We'll get to that. What would be an adverse effect here? You couldn't see in the dark. You'd essentially, if you were able to look directly at the sun without any adverse effects, you'd be essentially blind normally. In a situation where you're driving west at sunset, this might be a benefit. But are you actually better off overall? No. Or what about people with a severe milk allergy? Well, if there's ever a breakout of horrible microbes in the local dairy cows, not being able to drink milk is actually better off. But if not properly managed, are you actually better off overall?
No ice cream.
No ice cream, and that is the worst of it. That is the worst adverse effect. Without being able to take in milk long term and you don't manage it properly, you could actually lead to having a calcium and potassium deficiency. The human would not be better off overall. So what about our bacterium that developed an enlarged export pump? Hypothetically. Is the bacterium better off overall? In our hypothetical case of a bacterium that developed an enlarged export pump, the end result would actually be that it would expel too much, and it would end up expelling the good stuff, the stuff that it wants to keep. And it's not processing it, and it's not getting the nutrients from the stuff that it wants to keep. So in an effort to expel with antibiotics, it's actually worse off overall. That would be one of your examples. Just because the enlarged export pump helps it to expel antibiotics does not mean that that bacterium is actually better off in general. And that's functionally it. Those are all of the methods that they have for actually adding genetic information to the genome. Are they able to? Do they have an actual explanation? No. I say that's functionally it. There's a couple of different sections that we left out, but all of them fall into that category where there is no actual explanation for adding genetic information to the genome. But that doesn't stop them. And so here we're going to get into some really fun stuff. We're going to look at experiments that have actually been conducted to show genetic evolution. And we're going to see whether or not they've worked, and whether or not because of the results, genetic evolution is actually possible. We're going to start by looking at reproduction rates. These numbers are going to be made up by me for this first section. If you argue with these numbers, fine, we can argue with the little bits of these numbers, but you'll quickly see that the exact numbers here don't matter. So we're just going to go with it. For humans, on average, let's try and produce as many humans as possible in as little time as possible. Okay? And let's say that the average human has 3 offspring. It's significantly less than that in reality. Okay? Some will have more, some will have less. The general population average is probably somewhere around 2. Let's round 2 up to 3. Okay? Let's say that it takes the average human 20 years to go from born to reproducing and fulfilling the generational cycle. Okay? That's way low side of average. Most people, it's going to take significantly more. Okay? Some people it will take less. Most people it will take significantly more. But low side of average on that, let's round it down to 20-year generation. And so we're rounding up the amount of offspring, we're rounding down the amount of generations, or the time for the generation. So I want to look at what's going to happen after 100 years. If you run the math on that, there will be 5 generations of humans in that 100-year time span. You'll have the first human, then reproduce into 3, and each of those 3 reproduce into 3. So after just 2 generations, you have, what would that be, 13 total humans. Okay? And after the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th generation, at the end of this 100 years, you have 363 total humans across all 5 generations. Okay?
But it takes a pair to make one.
We're disregarding that
Disregard- cool,
for the math.
I was like,
Yeah,
that
no.
doesn't make sense in my brain.
We're already at too many people.
Cool.
For the sake of argument, we're not going to be biologically correct here.
Easy. I can get behind that.
5 generations and 363 humans. We could fudge this by a factor of 10. I don't care. Let's call it 50 generations and 3,600 humans. It wouldn't actually be that, but we'll get to why it doesn't actually matter here in a second. That seems like a lot of humans. And while it may sound like a lot, in theory, there could be a bit of variation from those humans, but they would all absolutely still be humans. Nobody's going to argue that they're not going to be humans after 5 generations. Okay? The evolutionary process where one species transforms into another slowly across many generations takes significantly longer and significantly more generations than what we can observe in 100 years of human evolution and human reproduction. So, let's look at the fruit fly. Let's run the same numbers on the fruit fly, and these are, this one and what will be here, are actual numbers, not numbers that I've just made up. So you can't argue these. You can try, but you won't be successful. A fruit fly on average will have 500 offspring in a single generation. Okay? A fruit fly on average will go from born to fulfilling the generational cycle within a week. So what about after that same 100 years? Over 5,000 generations will have occurred in the same 100 years. And that leads to a grand total of, that's a snapshot of the Excel spreadsheet that I was running these calculations in. It broke at year 2. We're talking untold amounts of fruit flies in a 100-year time span.
Broke at year 2.
Broke at year 2, which means it would have substantially broken by year 3 because we're talking exponential growth here. I didn't even bother trying to figure out what it would be at 100 years because it would be such a big number that we can't even fathom that. Excel broke at year 2. That's a lot more generations than just 5. If we were to say, what would happen how many years would it be if we observed 5,000 human generations? Let's take the fruit fly and extrapolate it out. How many human generations worth are we seeing? You're looking at about 100,000 years worth of human generations to get that many generations and that many fruit flies. It would take 100,000 years for humans to do what fruit flies can do in just 100. Okay? But that's not all. What about the E. coli bacteria? First of all, the E. coli bacteria can, in theory, reproduce infinitely. Okay? Because one bacterium can split into 2, can split into 2, can split into 2. There's no real generational cap, whereas 500 offspring in a single generation, it could, in theory, be as many as we want. And under prime conditions, the E. coli bacteria can reproduce within 20 minutes. 20 years, 1 week, 20 minutes. As this gets bigger and this gets smaller, these are going to get huge. Okay? So let's run the same 100-year calculation. After 100 years, you would have 2.6 million generations of E. coli bacteria. And you'd have a grand total. I'm not even gonna. We're not even gonna try with that. Okay. After 7 hours, one single bacterium could, in theory, duplicate to over 2 million bacteria. 7 hours to go from 1 to 2 million. We're not even going to touch what happens down here. Okay. Generationally speaking, if we were to take 2.6 million generations and figure out how long humans would have to go to see 2.6 million generations, it would take, by our rough estimates, 52 million years of human evolution and human reproduction to get to this level of generations. And that's our estimates. A more accurate and atheistic scientist approved estimate would actually be 78 million years of human equivalent generations. 78 million years of potential evolution that we can observe in 100. Have I been saying that we can observe it this whole time? We have observed this. We've observed fruit flies for 100 years. We've observed E. coli for 100 years. Okay? So what do we see? Because this could help us solve evolution. This could help us solve the problem with evolution. We've never observed a macroevolutionary change from one species to another. And this is a glaring issue with evolution. But of course we haven't. It takes too long and takes far too many generations to go from one species to another. It would never look to us like macroevolutionary change was happening because of how zoomed in on the timeline we are. So, if we could zoom out, and we could, in theory, observe millions of years of equivalent human generations in another species, in theory, that would allow us to observe some sort of evolutionary change from one species to another. If macroevolution is possible, then zooming out and observing a time scale that large should give ample opportunity for such a macroevolutionary change to take place. At the very least, we're going to get pretty solid evidence to know whether or not it's even possible to go from one species to another. And if we zoom that far out and observe 78 million years of equivalent human generations, and we never observe a single macroevolutionary change, that is a significant indication that it's not possible. Because if it never happens once in 78 million years of equivalent generations, how would we expect it to have happened so many times in actual evolutionary history?
E. coli is the perfect example because it literally is like small. Like they're saying we came from single cell organisms. Right. Like this would be the perfect thing.
The
like,
perfect experiment.
It works.
And if it doesn't work once, how is it supposed to have worked thousands of times? Because it is. And so let's do a brief history lesson, history in quotes. In the last 78 million years, according to evolution, there was a fork between a common ancestor, one side of the fork becoming apes and humans, allegedly, and the other side becoming rabbits. We're that far back in the evolutionary timeline. Grass becomes a thing. Don't ask me how. Dinosaurs are wiped out. Another fork happens, one side continuing to becoming apes and humans, and the other side becoming lemurs. The ancestors of deer and bison begin to split off, some continuing to become deer and bison, the other becoming whales. So we evolved out of the water, and then we're evolving back into... Don't ask me how. Photosynthesis was invented, and that should earn the Nobel Peace Prize, because how do you just invent food production? We're not going to get into that. Apes and monkeys finally split from each other, and then humans and apes finally split off from that. There's a lot of macroevolution that has happened, allegedly, in the last 78 million years. Hundreds of thousands of macroevolutionary changes. So if we do zoom out and we look at the E. coli bacteria, and we zoom out and we look at the fruit flies, and we don't observe it once, how is it supposed to happen this many times?
What's the period of time that this is supposed to take place in?
78 million years.
So this is the proposed atheist history?
This is according to evolution. That's why history is in quotes. This is atheistic evolution timeline in the last 78 million years. And this is how many macroevolutionary changes they claim have happened in that time. And so when we look at the E. coli and we look at the fruit flies, we're looking at a similar time scale. So if it's going to happen this many times, it better happen that many times in those experiments.
Yeah, we should have dogs from E. coli.
We should have dogs from E. coli by this point.
Seriously.
See why they keep making it longer.
They have to continue to make it longer. Yeah. The reasonable question here, have we seen evolution in fruit flies or E. coli? Did they succeed? The E. coli, shockingly, after 100 years of observation, were still E. coli. The fruit flies were actually still fruit flies, but interestingly, there were additional tidbits that we're actually going to get into with the fruit flies. We'll just get into it. First of all, they contaminated the experiment. With the fruit fly experiment, in an effort to speed up the evolutionary process, the scientists who were observing the fruit flies introduced various mutations into the fruit fly mix. The whole point of this experiment should be to observe whether or not under normal genetic situations macroevolution is possible. Okay? But by adding mutations that did not naturally occur, they're no longer trying to observe if macroevolution could happen. They're forcing it to happen whether or not it actually would or could. Okay? So right away, we should recognize that we can't actually learn anything from this. We shouldn't be able to use these experiments from everything. They've tampered with the evidence and they've contaminated it from the get-go. Okay? Right away, throw the whole thing out the window. Let's give it to them. We've given them so much in this class. Let's give them this one more thing. Let's assume that the synthetically introduced mutations would have, or at least could have, occurred naturally if given enough time. Did it work? Despite the genetic tampering on behalf of the scientists, the experiments still didn't work. The fruit flies, shockingly, were still fruit flies. Now, they were abominable monsters, to be sure. Okay, there were some with different colors. There were some with different colored eyes. There were some that had no eyes at all. There were some that had an extra pair of non-functioning wings. There were some with legs growing out of their heads instead of antennae. But they were all still fruit flies. Everything in this experiment still produced fruit flies. And we'll actually get to see that right now. So on the left, you have a normal fruit fly with a normal antenna. On the right, you have a leg growing in place of the antenna. It's marred. It's a genetic deformity. It's still very much a fruit fly. On the left, again, you have a normal fruit fly with a single pair of functioning wings. On the right, you have the single pair of functioning wings and an extra pair of non-functioning wings.
So, were they able to maintain those genetic mutations across generations?
Most of the time, they died.
I would assume so, yeah.
Yeah. So, what little genetic information might be able to be retained, A, probably isn't useful because antennae serve a purpose that legs cannot fulfill. Wings that don't work are all but useless. Right, so even if they were able to retain it, this wouldn't get them any closer to evolution. But when you drastically alter like the purpose that the antennae serves and it no longer can serve that purpose because you've got a leg on your face, you're going to die.
Well, and on top of that, just even on the inside, being able to maintain things being in the incorrect place, even if on the outside it's not serving a purpose or it's missing something, like the internal workings would be so messed up. That doesn't help the longevity of the creature.
Right. They're marred beyond recognition. They don't function the way that they should. Most of them died. They're still very much fruit flies. Even beyond that, the bigger questions are still left unsolved. The fruit flies were assumed to exist. Where did they come from? The genetic information in the fruit flies was assumed to exist. Where did that information originally come from? Not to mention the logic and order that govern the laws of reproduction, the scientific law of biogenesis that even allows us to hypothesize about what the offspring of a fruit fly might look like, or a host of other scientific things that are just assumed in these experiments. Everything we've looked at this quarter so far was just assumed. And even when they just assumed that, they still can't get it to work. Even if these fruit fly experiments were shown to be successful, and they could figure out a way to take one species and mutate the daylights out of it until it was another species, atheists would still be hard-pressed to find answers for these more macro questions that we've been looking at so far this quarter. Nothing in these experiments actually accomplished anything. We started with fruit fly genetics. We ended with fruit fly genetics. Marred in extensive ways, but still very much so fruit fly genetics. No new genetic information was created from the thousands of generations of genetic mutations that we observed in these experiments. None of the fruit flies ever evolved fingers or fins. They never evolved the ability to walk on two legs or to think critically. So what should have been the breeding ground for a few, at least one, new species by macroevolution merely produced a bunch of fruit flies. Visually appalling, often completely dysfunctional, but still entirely fruit flies. And again, if it couldn't happen once in 100,000 years of human generations or 78 million years of human generations, if it couldn't happen once, how are we supposed to believe that it happened hundreds of thousands of times? This is famous geneticist Richard Goldschmidt, who studied these fruit fly experiments in depth. He's widely considered to be the first person to combine the ideas of genetics, development, and evolution, meaning that he all but came up with the idea to run these experiments. Okay? He studied these experiments and he concluded that the fruit fly experiments, despite the mutations that they produced, did not produce any evidence, let alone proof, of evolution. A quote, it says, "It is true that nobody thus far has produced a new species or genus by macromutation. And it is equally true that nobody has produced even a new species by the selection of macromutations." And he went on to make the point that even if we could hypothetically combine more than 1,000 of the mutations that we've observed in the experiments. So the individual fruit flies having individual mutations, even if we could take 1,000 of those individual mutations and combine them into one hypothetically mass mutated fruit fly, the amount of change there still wouldn't come close to producing a new species.
Just back to your thing from last week, it's still a copy of or rearranging of the genetic information that's already there.
Yeah.
They didn't add dog to fruit fly.
Right. And they didn't get fruit fly they didn't get dog out of fruit fly mutations.
Right, no.
And it goes back to the music analogy that we were looking at last week.
Yes.
Where you can have the same 7, same 12 notes, whichever scale you want to use, the same 12 notes, and you can rearrange it differently, but you're not going to come up with a 13th note.
No.
You might come up with something completely dysfunctional, and it sounds like you're sitting on the keyboard, but you're not going to come up with a 13th note, no matter how hard you try.
Yeah.
In other words, not only did these fruit fly experiments not even produce a single new species, when they should have produced several, if evolution were true, but even the sum of best of these experiments wouldn't even come close to producing a new species, let alone several. They've got no process for adding new genetic information. They've got no process for coming up with genetic mutation or genetic information. The processes that they have for trying to add additional information don't stack up scientifically. And when they've observed hundreds of thousands or millions of years of equivalent human generations, we see genetics holding consistent. Let's take a step back for a second. What would we expect under the creation worldview? If God created individual creatures and said, "You will reproduce after your kind," would we expect such boundaries where fruit flies continue to produce fruit flies? Despite hundreds of thousands of millions of years of equivalent humans, mutations, and generations, we would expect fruit flies to still be fruit flies. The evidence that we see lines up perfectly with what we would understand from Scripture. And it completely flies in the face of everything that we would understand if evolution were true. Are there any questions, comments, concerns, complaints? Anything with any of this? Anything that we didn't cover? Any examples that you have questions on? Because this is the best that they've got.
So there's a group of lions on an island, in Africa, that water kind of merged around this massive land.
Okay.
And there's water buffalo that are on the island with them, and the lions have become like ridiculously strong and very large to combat the water buffalo. That's their only source of food. Right. In a situation like that, we were able to observe it over several generations, and see what actually took place. But you're able to see the children of the lions being stronger and faster and able to cope with their specific circumstances. In that situation, would that fall under like the epigenetic modification, or would that be a microevolution inside?
Probably a microevolution would be where I would go with that, because in order to get the food, you have to fight off the water buffalo. That takes strength. And so if you're a weaker lion, you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to get the food. You're not going to survive to reproduce. So on average, after several generations, only the best genetics survive. But again, that gets back to natural selection via microevolution, where you still can't add additional information.
Yeah, no, it's still definitely a lion. I was, I was just curious about how I would classify that. Cool.
For sure.